So the MasterChef scandal rumbles on. Gregg Wallace was officially sacked this week after an independent review of his conduct upheld the majority of the complaints. John Torode, his co-host, was also sacked for using an alleged racial slur. Tom, what have you made of this scandal?
I think this is a classic example of how the BBC underreacts to something and then overreacts far too late. So you have something like the Gregg Wallace scandal. Well, clearly he was being, at the very least you could say, very boorish at work. These 45 complaints which have been upheld. So it's a law firm who were hired to look into this. This isn't the same as him, necessarily having his day in court, especially where the more serious allegations are concerned. But the vast majority of the allegations, such as they are about boorish comments about sex, racially risque jokes and accents and so on. And also kind of, grim, intrusive comments about his sex life and other people's. This is the sort of thing where surely someone at the BBC or the production company should have said, you know what, Greg, it's 9 a.m. in the morning. Maybe your comments about your aunt's nether regions are not appropriate. Yeah. Maybe that's something that could have been dealt with earlier on. And yet they let it run and run and run and run and run for almost 2 decades. And then they overreact, which is say not only does this man have to be sacked, which is one thing, but also briefly considering actually shelving any of the episodes in which he features, like kind of Commissar Vanishes style, is absurd. And then you have the John Torode thing, who just seems to have just got caught in the crossfire of all of this. This particular allegation, which is in the same dossier that was put together by this law firm, is so vague as to, I find it mind-boggling that anyone would think his head should roll over this. It refers to one incident, they can't work out whether it's 2018 or 2019, in which he used what is referred to as racial language, which is vague as it is. According to John Torode's account, he has no memory of this whatsoever. He suspects it didn't even happen, and that the person he's pretty convinced he was having this allegedly problematic conversation with was not offended, and says that he apologised immediately. So anyone who thinks that in those circumstances someone should be hung, drawn and quartered is onto a, I don't think anyone really actually thinks that. But I think this is the problem. It's they underreact, then they overreact. And because there is this desperation to show that they're taking the Gregg Wallace scandal seriously, they even throw people like John Torode under the bus. But also I think it becomes a kind of useful deflection from much deeper questions that people were asking about the BBC recently. If the BBC has a problem, say, with racism, it's quite clearly where that is. It's the anti-Semitism. It's what happened at Glastonbury a few weeks ago. So rather than, if they wanted to ask questions about, are we rooting out genuine prejudice in our organisation, maybe they should try and work out why none of their staff who were monitoring that live stream thought it might be a good idea to pull it when Bob Vylan starts chanting death to the IDF. So as ever, I think it's deflection, it's displacement activity, and it's, again, I think particularly with the way this is developed over the past couple of days, a kind of reminder that the kind of hysteria that was attendant to Me Too and BLM hasn't really gone away. It's just been institutionalized kind of in so many respects. We probably have hit a peak, as I know Andrew has written very eloquently about, but at the same time it's still there and can still be exploited by people, either for the sake of trying to get some good PR, trying to deal with a problem in terms of negative media attention, or just cynical operators trying to tear down someone they maybe didn't like to begin with. So it's an absolute mess that only the BBC could make for itself, I would say.
Andrew, what's your take on it?
Well, I mean, I have a number of concerns about this. I mean, I think the John Torode thing, it seems so nebulous as to be absolute nonsense. And there have been so many examples, haven't there, of people sacked or disciplined for overheard conversations where the person who has been eavesdropping hasn't fully understood the context. There was that Lloyd's bank manager who was sacked for using a racial epithet. He was quoting it to make a point about anti-racism, and he was sacked as a result of that. I know someone who was suspended for a long time because someone overheard, and again, it was an anecdote, it was a quotation in which the racial epithet was used, and everyone in the conversation understood the context, so there was no risk of offence, but someone overheard, and there was a disciplinary procedure as a result. All of that is nonsense. So, but then when it comes to the Gregg Wallace thing, I think it is true that when you do certain jobs, you do sign up for a certain mode of conduct, and that includes the way that you speak to people. So I don't think we can just say this is a blanket free speech a violation for them to say he can't make these kinds of jokes, because he sort of agreed tacitly in taking the job that he's not going to do that. However, at the same time, I'm a little nervous about that. I mean, I think of my own experience when I was teaching at a boarding school in the middle of the countryside. Now, we wouldn't speak in a rambunctious way in front of the kids, and we wouldn't banter in the way that because you've got a professional responsibility. But living in an isolated community like that, my lifeline was people making inappropriate jokes and saying things that men and women, I have to say, like both of, this is something that was absolutely necessary. And I do worry that we're reaching the point where the workplace, the policing of language in the workplace is such that we can't even have those lifelines anymore. Those are the things that make work bearable sometimes, is people pushing the boundaries and saying things that you're not really meant to say and being mischievous. And I do worry that we're becoming so fragile that even an off-color joke is considered, it's a form of harm, and we need to make sure that person is sacked or disciplined. And I do worry about that.
And there was a period, I think it was last year when this scandal first fully emerged, and Gregg Wallace was on every, front page of every newspaper for a week. And you would have thought he was literally Hitler, the way that people were talking about him. A lot of his behavior was boorish. It wasn't just jokes and language, some very, inappropriate sexual behavior. But again, he was not the worst human being in the world, and it seems to have been blown up into out of all proportion, in a way that you can't actually have a sensible conversation about what you should do about those kinds of behavior.
Fraser, I want to know, what happened to just going up to someone saying, "Hang on, mate, that was a bit much." I was talking about the kind of boorish behavior that I experienced when I was a teacher, and occasionally it did go too far. I mean, one guy lifted me up by the back of my trousers and threw me across the room, thinking it was a form of banter. It really actually hurt, and I said to him, "Don't do that. We're adults. We can negotiate the messy business of life and talk to each other, and we can be honest with each other when things go slightly too far. I mean, that's part of being an adult. Not running off, scurrying off to the authorities and saying, 'Oh, he hurt my feelings.' We're not kids, So that's what that's the kind of thing I worry about. And it's become the norm now that you hear something that maybe oversteps the boundary a bit, what you think is oversteps your own personal boundary. And rather than addressing it directly to the person concerned, you go off to an authority figure. Pathetic.
And it's one of those things where kind of quietly, without, in some respects, many people noticing, the sort of rules of engagement in a workplace or in any other area of social life have just sort of been rewritten by the most easily offended or sometimes just cynical people amongst us. And it's going to take a long time for us to reckon with that, because you're exactly right, Andrew. Just the spontaneity, the ability to let off steam, even in a work setting or whatever. I'm not talking about the full gamut of what Gregg Wallace is accused of doing here, but nevertheless, there is clearly a problem with that being chilled by this kind of hyper-regulation, this hypersensitivity, and you lose a lot when that takes place. And it's one of those things that, as well, everyone knows that it's happening. No one really supports it, but at the same time, we're sort of lumbered with it as the sort of legacy of the not just 2020, but the kind of decades preceding that. So whilst I think we can, on this issue, as on so many others, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You could say that there's certain behaviour which was unacceptable, that should have been dealt with, that should have been nipped in the bud, whilst also recognising this is clearly in a climate which is going much further beyond that in terms of policing how we interact with one another.